You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Health Podcast. I have Matthew Lungren, Assistant Professor of Radiology, Pediatric Radiology at the Stanford University Medical Center. And we were talking about AI hive mind diagnoses of conditions such as pneumonia. So Matthew, thanks for coming. How you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, there's an interesting concept. I recently spoke to a company that talked about, they call it swarms, but it's collective decision-making. But I'd rather you, talk about it than myself. So how did this concept of hive mind or collective decision-making even come up, at Stanford? It seems like, in the medical field, doctors want to just decide on their own and be heroes. But tell me a little bit about the background of how this came about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. The concept of using the hive mind for making better human-based decisions or collective decisions was actually from a startup company called Unanimous.ai, and it's led by a group of very talented senior researchers who had a technology that they believed could harness the power of human intelligence in creative ways to make predictions. And because there's a lot of science behind that idea if you can do it right. And so they had essentially spent a lot of their early years working on things like, predicting stock market outcomes or predicting, winners of sporting championships and things like that, right? And then they started to think a little bit more about what other areas might benefit from these kinds of technologies. And so they reached out to me, I guess maybe it's been almost 2 years now, and said, hey, this is what we do. This is our technology. It uses relatively sophisticated, software, including components of AI to connect humans in making decisions. And they wondered if there were things at least in my area in radiology, but broadly in medicine, that could use this technology to sort of make better decisions. And so we started a collaboration around it, and found a use case that was at least a popular topic at that time, which was when we had first released our work on detecting pneumonia on chest x-rays, which we were one of the first groups to do that and show that we could do that with AI alone at human level performance. And the idea here was, could a group of humans then do even better than either the AI model or a human alone? And so that's sort of what started that journey.
Well, I've seen articles about, let's say in the world of chess, you have grandmasters. Then you have grandmasters collaborating with AI systems, and it makes them even more powerful. So that seems to be one person, one machine. This is what, just a group of people? Is it a group of people plus AI, or how is it structured?
Yeah, so the way technology works is that, it takes a group of people, and that's where the sort of the swarm idea comes from, and then sort of asks everyone collectively the same question. So it's a real-time interaction. But unlike sort of a large conference call or something where you're trying to make a decision by committee, you don't actually know the identity of anyone else in this swarm. And there's a very graphical way that the people that are swarming interface that the company has put together, and allows you to kind of, drive this little, it's kind of like, it's called a puck. But essentially, if you can imagine maybe a puck on ice that's, can be slid around, and each person has essentially a magnetic force that they can apply to that puck to pull it towards the answer that they believe is correct. And what happens is that, let's say there's 10 different people all trying to pull this puck with their own magnetic force towards the direction of an answer. Even on fine-grained sort of answering or decisions, you can imagine that people are pulling in different directions, right? But eventually what tends to happen with this is that a decision is reached when either there's a stalemate and people pulling in two directions or whateor, or you've kind of landed in an area or there's sort of a few that kind of just say, well, I initially was pulling in this direction, but I see that the entire group is pulling the other way. Maybe I will compromise in some fashion and pull a little less hard towards my answer, and so you see those interactions happening in real time. And it's fascinating to see how accurate they end up being as a group. And I got the chance to participate in this a few times, and it was remarkable. I was very skeptical at first, and came out a believer.
Well, why is this better than a bunch of colleagues sitting in a room with a picture of a lung up on the board, the light box, and discussing what they think it is?
Yeah, we've thought about that a lot, and actually this has sort of led to a lot more areas where we think this technology could have some benefit in medicine. But the reason is that for number one, as you know, in any meeting, there's often a leader, or there's often a person that may have more authority in some other way. They're very senior, or maybe they're famous for something or whatever. And when you have a group of people that include a heterogeneous degree of introvert, extroverts, famous, not famous, whatever, leadership position, not leadership position, you tend to sort of find that, at least in my experience, that would skew decisions deferring towards potentially those that have more authority, and maybe they're right, but maybe they're not. And decisions could get made in that way. And I think in medicine, which tends to still be fairly hierarchical, you might find that decisions could be made with a lot less than the entire effort of the group in the room, because maybe the leader of the group or a respected authority or whatever has decided it's X, whereas maybe there's 4 or 5 people in the room that actually think it's Y. What factors that play into them not influencing that decision that's an entire area of sociology, right? To discover what those factors are. We all, I believe, in our lives inherently have situations where we've experienced that, right? And what this swarm technology does, beyond just the fact that it has kind of an AI, interaction background, it also allows anonymity and essentially equal weight to anyone in the group. Now, if you just had a very experienced person and a very inexperienced person, I'm not entirely convinced that the swarm would be better. But the advantage then is that you have, 7, 8, 10, a dozen people in space collectively making that decision, putting effort into that decision, right? There's not like a meeting where people are on their phones or getting distracted or whatever, side conversations. This is literally everyone's focused on making that decision, which I believe also plays a part into that. But in general, it's a wonderful platform if you are in a situation where, for example, you don't have a ground truth. So maybe you don't know what it is and you need to make a decision on what that is. Finding that can be a better way to source that is fascinating. And to get to a place where, this could be used for areas outside of just, diagnostic imaging or making a diagnosis, you can imagine that there are many decisions in medicine that are often made by groups of people. And again, as we've all experienced, with a large group of people, no matter how educated or organized, there is still just a heterogeneous and ultimately maybe not efficient way that we tend to sort of fall to a collective decision in a lot of those settings. Now, has it worked for eons in medicine? Sure. But is this potentially a technology that we could see, invading some of these areas and making parts of medicine more responsive, better, making better predictive decisions, making better treatment decisions? Maybe. And I think that's a very interesting line of inquiry that we're looking into. Again, just thinking outside of simply diagnostic radiology.
All right, so some questions about it. Are you choosing who is going to be in the group? You just don't know once they're in the group who is speaking on a particular topic, or are you actually getting people into the group that you don't even know who they are from the outset?
So that's a great question. They've worked on other areas where they can use the wisdom of a crowd in a much larger setting, where they can literally just sample Joe Smith off the street, right, and just have dozens.
No, I know. I'm talking about in a medical decision in the hospital. So as an example, patient X, I can see this being useful if you brought in all the nurses or nurse caring for the patient, the doctor that's on call, plus a specialist, plus, someone else. So they all know who's going to be there. They just don't know who's who once they're in the room. Essentially, they're, blindfolded. So they could all discuss, but the nurse maybe doesn't have to feel intimidated because the other people in the room, she doesn't know who they are. They don't know who she is, once they're in the room. So they can all comment more in relative social safety and still be heard. Is that kind of how it happens, or is it different?
Well, I mean, it's obviously, yeah. I mean, I think in some way that's true. It's sort of an interaction on a computer, right? So, so you actually aren't hearing or seeing anyone. So there's literally no potential for bias there in terms of knowing who. Now, obviously, maybe broadly, if there's 10 people, who those 10 people are, but there's no way to identify, that as part of this, decision-making process in here. And so, I think that's an interesting thought. Could you use it for, day-to-day treatment? I think it would be pretty inefficient to make day-to-day treatment decisions, but certainly for large decisions like, does this person need a liver transplant, or organ allocation for those liver transplants, or what kind of chemotherapy to use if there's other options. So those big decisions that are often made in medicine by a committee, you can imagine that this sort of semi-anonymous way of making decisions where everyone's engaged in making, sort of a decision on a case-by-case basis in that environment might be better.
Okay, so for more serious things, let's say, again, someone, maybe a liver transplant candidate, what would a swarm there look like, or a hive mind? It would be 4 or 5 different, liver specialists, and they would go into this swarm and then just discuss openly there. What is the first? How is the group chosen, and then what is the hive mind application look like?
Yeah, exactly.
When you're in it.
It's a great question. Yeah. So in our experiment where, they put up, there's a moderator, right, who is not involved in medicine, who kind of sets up the questions ahead of time that need to be asked. So, showing an image to a group of people that are all logged in on the swarm, right? They're all connected to this, software running in the background, and presenting a user interface, as I had described, which is sort of like this puck that you kind of, graphically move around in a group of other people. The way that decision's made is, again, there's a moderator that says, hey, here's image number 1. Please move the puck towards the percentage likelihood that there's pneumonia on this x-ray, right? And so the counter will start, and everyone you don't know who they are, but everyone's on this interface, and we're all trying to pull this puck, move it to the place that represents the likelihood. So if I think it's 75% likely, then I will pull it towards 75. And other people may believe it's 25%, so they're pulling it towards 25. And if there are a majority of people that are pulling it maybe in the 25 direction, then I will ultimately not affect the puck to move, or the final decision to be at 75. So maybe it'll be at like 26%, because I've decided it's definitely more than 25, or whatever that is. And so that is actually the proprietary piece of this, this group's work, which is just sort of how that, decision ultimately falls, and how much strength, each individual sort of weighs in on the decision. But in general, if you were using this example, you take 10 radiologists and you ask them to, be on this decision software program swarm at a certain time. We all would log in at our own computers, and we would go through the cases that were part of this test. Now, in a real clinical setting, that's an incredibly inefficient way to do routine care, but you can imagine that there are cases that are difficult. There are certainly situations, as I've mentioned with the liver example, is that there are already groups. So you would just have the group just be on the swarm as opposed to meeting in person, right? And
so, I mean, if you had this for a particular process and you wanted to really test it out, you would quantify the process, and that would speed it along. Let's say when radiologists look at a radiograph of, again, a certain part of, let's say, just talk about lungs, all right? They're looking for pneumonia or lung tumors. You probably could break this down into a series of steps that they always tend to go through by asking a few of them. And then you step the group through the steps. Look at the lower lobe here. Do you see blah, blah, blah? Yes, no. Look at this. Do you see that? Look at that. Do you see that? And then, what is your opinion of this based on these 5 observations that are here in the picture? And if you step people through it, I think you'll be pretty efficient, and you can still get everyone's input and then drive towards a decision.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. So what you're saying is, like, can you systematically walk people through the diagnostic process? And I think that's one way to do it. That, for most types of imaging, using the chest X-ray as an example, it takes less than a second for most radiologists to make their decision on what they think it is. I mean, we've looked at hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these. So we have become very good. So, but to your point, if you had a more complex imaging study, so let's say, for example, a whole body MR, which is incredibly complex, has thousands of images, in that case, then yes, if you're trying to put a swarm together around a difficult case, you would want to direct the group to certain parts of the study to make it more efficient, because otherwise you'd be spending a lot of time going through things that aren't really, applicable to the problem. So yeah, that's exactly right. That's how you would make that more efficient in a large study. But for chest X-ray, again, we can pretty much make a decision around. Some studies have shown around a second it takes for someone to decide who's experienced whether it's normal or not. So that first decision's already out, and then really only a few more seconds to figure out what is going on.
Well, I understand it's for more complex cases. My example wasn't good, but okay, gotcha.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah, exactly.
So instead of people, or in addition to people just nudging percentages, what if you have to make a comment in order to support your percentage? I think it's 70% this way instead of 70% that way. Can you say, here's why, and put a comment in?
I think that's the brilliance of this, is that there is literally no other interaction besides just moving this around. So it really doesn't matter if you have enough people in the swarm, whether your justification for your decision is based on, your belief, your evidence you read about, whatever, and maybe it's just a gestalt. But as a group, that decision is ultimately, at least with this logic, more informed than any one individual. So again, I think that if you had the option to make your case, as you're suggesting, my concern there again would be that you're back to the committee model, where someone may be better informed and persuades someone using evidence, right, or a great, well-crafted argument, and that would, potentially bias either rightly or wrongly towards that person's opinion. And I think that the beauty of this, especially when you have, again, 10, 12 people all interacting anonymously, is you just have to pull the puck to where you think the answer is. And sometimes the more experienced people are like, in fact, an anecdote here was, in our group, we had a very experienced senior chest radiologist. So he's a specialist just in looking at, x-rays and CTs of the chest. And he walked away from the whole thing thinking these guys made a lot of bad decisions as a group, because he was, he found himself pulling in a different direction than the group were at certain points. And he was the most surprised to see at the end how well the group did on the diagnostic task, and in some cases beating his performance individually, which was really a surprise.
Yeah, but who determines the points that the puck can be pulled to? That could skew things if, one that should be there isn't there, or maybe somehow one is overrepresented because it shows up as two different pull points.
Yeah, so the way it's lined up is actually pretty elegant. So in the first round, there's 5 choices between 0 and 15%, for example, and then you kind of go all the way up to 100. And then once the group has decided in which bucket it would go into, then you have a second follow-up that puts it on kind of a longitudinal timeline from the, if we all chose it was between 0 and 10% likely as a group, then it goes to a second piece, which is 0s on one end of this line and 10s on the other end of the line. And you have to pull it now along the line to land in the right spot. So they've actually done an incredible job to remove things like, biases that would be from, as you've suggested, overrepresentation or leaving potential answers out. And so, yeah, but that's a great question, because you would be concerned if you weren't represented. You could write a bad question and end up with, a completely useless prediction because you've left out all the possibilities.
Yeah, that's what I mean, is how do you control for something like that? Like the person that creates the hive would have to know probably quite a bit about the problem. They can't just randomly throw stuff up there. So does that person bias the process in such a way where you really can't get the right answer? Like, how do you do that?
Well, for diagnostic tasks, that's less of an issue if you're looking at narrow areas. So, for example, if you're looking at pneumonia, your question is there pneumonia? What's the likelihood of pneumonia on this film? And there's no real way to continue to bias that the way that they had set it up, in the sense that they give likelihood percentages of yes. Now, if you said, what's the likelihood that this is normal or not, or something, a little bit more broad, then maybe, somebody might consider abnormality being, anything. And some other people might consider abnormality only counting for things in the lung, and there other stuff that's around there doesn't count. So there definitely could be issues with not understanding the rules of the questions or understanding the premise of the questions correctly, and that would be a concern if you use this in sort of a haphazard way. I think that, again, having well-defined questions before starting this, and ultimately that's what you would use it for, because as I said earlier, it's a pretty inefficient use of time for clinicians to do this on every case, right, on every decision. But for tough things and for things that matter, And for things that humans aren't really awesome at, it could be pretty great.
Okay. So where do you see this evolving, or how do you see, hospitals or doctors or other medical systems using this test?
I'm not sure yet. I think we're still in a very much an exploratory mode. I think that the work that you've seen and that is making its way. We actually did some follow-up work that hopefully will be published soon. That was the work that I believe that you mentioned at the beginning that we discussed was based on an abstract at a conference, and so we've actually gone on to do more work around that problem. But our job is to sort of find spots in the medical care, system that have some big impact. So I think, I kind of referenced the idea of organ transplant earlier. I think that's an important area. Also, something called Tumor Boards, where, again, a lot of doctors get together and try to make difficult decisions on certain patients that are either very complicated or having some sort of major decision point in their care. If that's done by a group of people, 15 doctors in a room at, a certain time, you can imagine that there would be opportunities there to potentially explore how the swarm technology would compare and how the patients that were, sort of underwent that decision-making process versus the typical meeting process, how they fared differently or what their outcomes were. Those are larger studies that would require, a great deal of effort and time that we're sort of still gathering data to make sure that it makes sense to attempt one of those.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, very good. Any other tweaks or surprises or interesting ways that you've thought of to use this that are not currently being proposed to you?
Well, I was actually hoping to ask them if I could use this to predict the outcome of the March Madness because my bracket was terrible, but they wouldn't let me do that. So I don't have anything I can share with you beyond that.
That's funny. When you used it, any observations you had that, again, were surprising to you? I don't know if we've covered them, but anything else when you went through it yourself?
Yeah, I think, just sort of back to the earlier, discussion, I really was surprised that it worked. I was a huge skeptic of this at the beginning. And in that test and then in follow-up tests, we've consistently seen how well it does. And, we are believers now. It's just about trying to figure out how do we put this in the right place to have the biggest impact for our patients.
Do you see the AI-assisted doctoring, I'll call it, as could it be done in this way somehow, where the AI acts as the other invisible partner in the hive mind or the swarm, even for smaller decisions? I guess one way to do it is, a patient comes in, looks like they have XYZ going on with them. The AI says, check this, check that, look at it. Another way maybe is same scenario, but it looks more like a hive mind type application with a nudging of like you said, of a puck. Any, with just two people, again, one AI, one doctor, would that be a better mechanism to do it? Do you see any application there, or it needs more than that to work?
Well, so now that you're mentioning, obviously so I'm the associate director of the Artificial Intelligence and Medicine Imaging Center at Stanford, and in that role, which goes well beyond this research, we have close to 100 now different projects that involve the use of AI in medical applications. And, so there are literally almost an infinite number of possible human, AI combinations, and where AI can make major impacts in sort of the work that we do in healthcare, and figuring out, just as you're suggesting, what are the optimal places where the human and machine can interact and, ultimately have better outcomes for patients. That's literally all we do all day, is try to figure that out. And we've had some really interesting success using individual AI models that were trained to make, very specific decisions, and then sort of having that model help the human with some additional information in that case, and then together, quote unquote, together, they're making a final decision on the patient. So those areas are great. Now, swarming, I think, is a different interaction that has not, in my mind, ever been done in the way that this company has done it. And so that was one of the reasons we were intrigued and brought them on board to work with us, because we hadn't considered the fact that multiple humans together could be sort of augmented with AI in a different way, not like AI is trying to do the same job as the human, but in this case, AI is facilitating the humans making better decisions, if that makes sense. And so that's what was so cool about the Swarm project. But to answer your question more broadly, there are many different applications of AI models that work in different levels of healthcare, and they act in a similar way to humans. And so adding that decision onto the human just makes the humans better informed, at least in our experience.
Yeah, I just didn't know if this, this hive mind model gave you yet another way for people to interact with AI, not just other people.
Absolutely. That's why we're excited about it. I mean, because again, we say AI here, and then obviously that term is abused. But in general, the sort of type of machine learning or AI that's happening here is vastly different than the type that I think that we see grabbing headlines for other work that either we or our colleagues around the world are doing. In the sense that there's no duplication of a human task here. And so that's why we're excited, I think, about adding this to the sort of armamentarium that we have, to say, hey, maybe you and I and, 10 of our closest friends are doing a March Madness bracket or whatever. Can we make a better decision together with something like this? Same thing in medicine. Hey, I've got this really complicated patient and I want to make sure they have the best possible outcome. Let's get this together and get a swarm on this and see what decision we would come to that way.
Okay, well, very good. So what's the best way for listeners to find out more and maybe to reach out and ask questions?
Yes, so I would definitely put a plug in for Unanimous. It's at their site, unanimous.ai, and they have plenty of videos and in fact, I think they were featured at South by Southwest. So they're having tremendous success, and we're very excited to work with them at Stanford as a partner. And then in terms of questions for me, obviously I can be reached at mlungren@stanford.edu, and then on Twitter, Matt Lungren, MD. And happy to entertain questions and comments.
That's great. Well, Matthew, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for hosting.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.